our book goes into much more detail about the relationships and also about fighting the case and trying to expose this scandal. Moving on to the public inquiry into undercover policing, in 2014, the Home Secretary announced a public inquiry into undercover policing to investigate the actions of these secret political police units, which included the abusive undercover relationships that we had exposed. And it also was to look into the revelations by the police whistleblower, Pete Francis, that the police had spied on the grieving family and friends of the murdered black teenager Stephen Lawrence, rather than investigating the racist murderers. The inquiry opened in 2015, but it actually only started hearing evidence in 2020. It's been beset by delays caused by police demands for secrecy. But what we do now know is that over 1,000 groups were spied on in the UK. The inquiry has so far refused to name most of them, but we do know that the vast majority were left-wing groups. There were only a handful of right-wing groups, and we do know that the groups spied on include women's groups, as well as trade unions, anti-racist campaigns, family justice campaigns, peace campaigns, and environmental groups. Campaigners have been fighting for the release of the cover names used by the officers. Despite this, the inquiry has released less than half the cover names. But without the cover names being disclosed, that means the people spied on can't give evidence to the inquiry about what the officers did. So it can't really get a true picture of what happened. And it also means that other women won't also be able to find out that they were deceived by these officers. When we started our case, there were 8 women involved, and we knew of a handful more. But now, with further research by campaigners and the release of some of the cover names of officers by the public inquiry, we know that more than 50 women have been deceived into relationships by undercover police officers in these secret political policing units. On the Police Spies Out of Lives website, there is actually a link to a timeline of all the officers who had relationships with women. The first officers gave evidence in November 2020 about their deployments, and more recently, in May this year, more senior officers have given evidence, about their management of the units. In the main, they have all been fairly evasive about who knew what about the relationships. Managers did give evidence that it was considered essential for undercover officers to have what they called stability and anchor. And so almost all of the officers were married men, which in theory gave them something to come back to and was supposed to prevent them from temptation. But really, there's, through our case and through the evidence in the inquiry, there's some really shocking evidence of institutional misogyny. One officer in particular gave a shocking response that he said, "I have, if you like, a phrase in my head which helps guide me here." This is in relation to whether officers should have relationships with women undercover. "I have, if you like, a phrase in my head which helps guide me here. If you ask me to infiltrate some drug dealers, you can't point the finger at me if I sample the product. If these people are in a certain environment where it's necessary to engage a little more deeply, then shall we say, I find this acceptable." Basically, they're comparing deceiving women into sex and relationships with sampling a drug. Perhaps realizing that he dropped a clanger, he went on to say that he did worry about the consequences for the female and any children that may result from the relationships.